Welcome to the Washington Office on Latin America, WOLA. I'm Jo Marie Burt. I'm a senior fellow here at WOLA and a professor at George Mason University. I'm very pleased to welcome you all here today for this event, Post-Election Optics in Guatemala, Judicial Cooptation and Gender Violence. So just want a couple quick logistical things. Simultaneous translation is available for those who need it. And this event is being recorded and will be available online for those who would like to access it later on. So just quick opening remarks, and I'm going to turn the panel over to our moderator. And I'll introduce our guests. So 4 months from today, on January 14th, President-elect Bernardo Arévalo should be inaugurated as president of Guatemala. His profile as an academic, diplomat, public official, and congressman of integrity, and his strong anti-corruption platform led to a remarkable victory of 20 percentage points over his opponent, former First Lady Sandra Torres. However, corrupt politicians and their operatives are doing everything in their power to deny Arévalo's victory and prevent him from taking office. And even if he does take office on January 14th, the deck is stacked against him. Courts and the Attorney General's office are controlled by corrupt elites. Congress is dominated by diverse right-wing political parties that are the political backbone of the so-called Pact of the Corrupt, which, with the backing of recalcitrant economic elites and sectors of the military, has undermined rule of law and democratic institutions in Guatemala, has used the courts and lawfare to criminalize not just opposition leaders, journalists, community activists, and human rights defenders, but also civil servants, including judges and prosecutors, in order to preserve their power, privilege, and impunity. The international community has played a critical role in denouncing the machinations of the incumbent regime. But the fact is, for years, a blind eye was turned to the accumulation of power of these same corrupt elites that has resulted in this moment of heightened tension. In the meantime, Guatemala is one of the poorest and most corrupt nations, not just in the Western Hemisphere, but in the world. It ranks, I was looking these numbers up this afternoon, and it is astounding. It ranks 150 out of 180 on Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. It ranks 135 out of 191 countries on the UN Human Development Index. That's bad, right? 1 is great, 191 is bad. 1 in 2 infants suffers chronic malnutrition. That's the highest rate in Latin America, the 6th highest rate in the world. And while overall levels of homicides have declined over the years, compared to record heights 15 or 20 years ago, gender-based violence, including feminicide, domestic violence, and sexual assault, continues to be an unmitigated and endemic problem. 98% of cases go unsolved. Today's panel discussion focuses on a new book by Dr. Victoria Sanford, Textures of Terror: The Murder of Claudina Velásquez and Her Father's Quest for Justice. In her book, Dr. Sanford investigates the unsolved case of law school student Claudina Isabel, who was murdered in 2005, and by so doing, unveils the inner workings of Guatemala's criminal justice system and how this co-opted system perpetuates corruption, inequality, impunity, and terror against women and children. Each of our speakers today have played key roles as activists, expert witnesses, investigators, and judges in efforts to combat corruption, impunity, and gender-based violence and feminicide in Guatemala. They will offer a granular appraisal of the Guatemalan criminal justice system, as well as concrete proposals for the international community to strengthen democracy and rule of law in this post-election transition process. So that is the end of my remarks. I'm going to now introduce our guest speakers. To my left, my good friend Erika Aifan. She's a Guatemalan former judge, most recently serving as judge for High Risk Court D, overseeing cases of serious acts of corruption involving political actors and business executives. Erika was issued protective orders by the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights in response to threats against her in the course of her career. She was recognized by the U.S. State Department with the International Women of Courage Award, and amidst mounting threats to her life and career, Erika renounced her position and fled her country in March 2021. She's currently a fellow at the RFK Human Rights and George Mason University, and has contributed invaluable work to the work of the ABBA Center for Human Rights. To my right is Dr. Victoria Sanford, also a very good friend, a public scholar, anthropologist, and internationally recognized expert on the Guatemalan genocide. She's the Lehman Professor of Excellence at Lehman College and the Graduate Center, CUNY, City University of New York, and the author of 7 books, including most recently the one we're talking about today, Textures of Terror. She's a fellow of the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation and the Bunting Peace Fellow at Harvard University's Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and she's held numerous fellowships at the U.S. Institute for Peace, the Virginia Foundation of the Humanities, among others. And finally, our moderator is Holly Draginis. Did I say it right? Oh my God, I said it right. Holly Draginis. We went along over how I had to say her last name. She's a senior legal advisor for the American Bar Association Center for Human Rights, which has programs supporting investigations into corruption and human rights abuse in Guatemala, as well as legal assistance for anti-corruption advocates targeted by criminalization. All of these women are anti-corruption and anti-impunity crusaders. Welcome.
Thank you, Jo Marie. And thanks to WOLA, Ana Maria, especially, and my colleague Alexandra for all the organizers joining today. And thanks to ABA Center for Human Rights for sponsoring. Just wanted to thank the ABA and WOLA for hosting the event. It is truly an honor to be in conversation today with 2 mentors and colleagues, 2 people who have done so much to create venues for individuals to speak truth to power and pursue accountability. As Jo Marie mentioned, we're here amidst escalating attacks on the independence of the justice sector and Indigenous communities in resistance to the theft and militarization of resource-rich land and ancestral land. We're here in the midst of a fraught political transition, the unexpected win of the Semilla party, and what that promises, and how that has also raised the hackles of those who are in power and running the status quo. And we're here to talk about Claudina Isabel and her case, what it says about the gendered nature of access to justice, its links to the current violent co-optation of the justice sector. And I just want to open by asking each of you how you arrived at the intersection of these issues. Victoria, how did you first become aware of Claudina Isabel's case? Tell us a little bit about her father, and how you were involved, and then Erika, I'll turn to you with another question.
Sure, thank you. And I also want to thank WOLA and the ABA, Jo Marie for this generous introduction, Holly for moderating, and an absolute honor to be here with Erika, Aifan, and thank all of you for coming here today, and for those who are listening online as well. I began my work in Guatemala in 1990. I started working with the Guatemalan Forensic Anthropology Foundation in 1994, doing research as a doctoral student. And my focus was really on massacres in rural communities, accompanying rural communities seeking justice, accompanied by massacre survivors in particular. And that's the background to answer Holly's very good question, because Amilcar Mendez, who's a human rights leader in Guatemala, in Quiché, who I had previously worked on some human rights cases with, he said, you have to come over to my house because I want you to meet someone. And usually when Amilcar would say that to me, it meant come to my house and meet this person I know from Quiché who needs you to accompany them. And even though my Spanish isn't perfect, it was generally at least as good or a little bit better, but mostly because of my condition of being a gringa, people would listen to me or at least take the meeting with the massacre survivors. So I got to Amilcar's home and I met Jorge Velásquez, Claudina Isabel's father, who was taller than me and whiter than me and an upper middle class accountant from Guatemala City, who certainly spoke Spanish better than I did. And I was profoundly confused. Why does he need me to be involved? And what I learned in the process of accompanying Jorge was that justice isn't available to anyone. And so that's my involvement in the case. And over the years, accompanying Jorge, what we basically did, because he is an auditor, really. So we did an audit of the legal system in Guatemala through his daughter's case. And that's really what the book is about. What was supposed to happen, what should have happened, what didn't happen. And we looked at what Guatemalan laws are and we matched them to international standards. And we looked at what happened in every phase of the case. And then it amplified it out to look at the status of the killing of women in Guatemala. In a nutshell.
Yeah. And Erika, you have been at the heart of issues of justice for grave crimes, especially corruption. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to be a high-risk court judge, what that means in the context of Guatemala, the Guatemalan justice system, for the few who may not know what that means, and a bit about some of the successes of that work?
Buenas tardes a todos y todas. Quiero comenzar agradeciendo la invitación y quiero compartirles que en Guatemala, a partir del establecimiento de una comisión especial contra la impunidad, que se llamó comúnmente por sus siglas CITI, se comenzaron a hacer cambios importantes en la justicia guatemalteca y se crearon y fortalecieron dos instituciones. Una Fiscalía Especial contra la Impunidad, conocida comúnmente como FES, que estuvo a cargo del diputado Juan Francisco Sandoval, y el sistema de juzgados de mayor riesgo. Los juzgados de mayor riesgo eran juzgados especializados que conocían de los procesos más graves en el país, cometidos por estructuras criminales y que representaban, como su nombre lo dice, un riesgo para quienes intervenían en estos procesos, bien fuera como víctimas, como testigos, como fiscales, como defensores o jueces. Yo comencé mi carrera judicial hace más de 20 años y fui especializándome en el área penal. Entonces, la Corte Suprema de Justicia tenía una saturación porque los casos eran demasiado grandes y los juzgados A, B y C de mayor riesgo, que eran los que cubrían todos estos casos, el juzgamiento de estos casos de alto impacto, estaban sobrepasados en sus capacidades para poder administrar justicia. Entonces, en ese contexto, el juzgado de mayor riesgo B tiene en el 2015 un caso que cambió el rumbo de la historia de la justicia de Guatemala, que fue conocido como el caso La Línea, porque involucraba en ese momento, entre otros actores indicados de corrupción, al presidente y vicepresidente de la nación en funciones. Y eran aproximadamente 70 personas las que el juez Galvez, que era el titular de este juzgado, estaba juzgando simultáneamente. Y entonces no podía atender los otros casos en los que habían personas que estaban privadas de libertad. Entonces, la Corte Suprema de Justicia se vio en la necesidad de crear un juzgado más. Y así surge el juzgado de mayor riesgo T, que comienza a funcionar dentro del juzgado de mayor riesgo B, a cargo del licenciado Galvez. Y entonces, la Corte abre a convocatoria para poder ocupar la plaza de juez del juzgado de mayor riesgo D. Y alguien me manda la información y me invita a participar. Yo tenía dudas de hacerlo porque creía que los procedimientos de selección de jueces todavía no eran muy claros. en el país, y las juezas siempre éramos discriminadas en la materia de acceso a ascensos, a oportunidades, a cursos, etcétera. Pero decidí tomar el riesgo y pues gracias a Dios fui tomada en consideración. Estando ya dentro de los juzgados de mayor riesgo, pude ver que la mayoría éramos juezas y pude también conocer de la valentía, de la capacidad, del profesionalismo de las otras compañeras. Y eso pues me llenó mucho como persona y también pues nos permitió conocer casos de alto impacto en contra de mujeres y de niñas.
A lot of what we're seeing now in terms of the tool for consolidation of power is the co-optation of the justice. And there's a lot of discussion about that among civil society in Guatemala, in the international community. I wonder if you could say a bit, Erika, about what that looked like from your position as a high-risk judge, what it looked like in your docket, and also how it functioned when you finally decided to flee into exile, how the co-optation, what the mechanics are, what does it look like? What are the mechanisms of that concept and how it affected you in your professional and your personal experience?
Pues en esta historia que comencé a compartirles, las personas que nos vimos involucradas en la administración de justicia, pudimos ir viendo resultados y conociendo la existencia de macroredes criminales en el país que actuaban al interior y también al exterior del país. Y comenzamos a ver procesos de una magnitud increíble. Y ante esto, pues definitivamente cuando hablamos de macroredes, hablamos de una cantidad innumerable de actores corruptos que están interrelacionados entre sí. Entonces, obviamente, estas macroestructuras comenzaron a reaccionar frente al avance de la lucha anticorrupción y se unieron. ¿Sabéis? Dentro de estas macroredes habían personas que pudieron acceder a puestos de poder dentro del Estado por la cantidad de personas, por la ubicación, porque la corrupción siempre busca actuar a la sombra, siempre busca ese ocultamiento de las identidades de los actores corruptos. Pues en Guatemala ha sido difícil señalar con precisión a todas las personas que integran esta estructura de cooptación del Estado, pero ha sido tan evidente su accionar que los guatemaltecos la han llamado el pacto de corruptos. Y ese pacto de corruptos se ha manifestado a través de algunas acciones concretas en contra de operadores de justicia, en contra de periodistas y en este momento de la historia de nuestro país, en contra del presidente, vicepresidenta electa. Y entonces podemos ver a través de esas manifestaciones que han sido públicas cómo estos ataques provienen de los mismos poderes del Estado, del poder ejecutivo, del poder legislativo y del poder judicial, aunados a estructuras de crimen organizado y narcotráfico. Algunas de estas personas ya han sido sancionadas, otras personas están sindicadas en procesos que han sido detenidos para generar impunidad. Porque, pues, este pacto de corruptos, frente al avance del sistema de justicia, establecieron una estrategia, y esta estrategia partió de finalizar el mandato del asistir. Después, el objetivo fue buscar personas que eran probas dentro del sistema de puestos claves y sustituirlas por personas que no respondían a esos requisitos de probidad. Dentro de estos, yo llamo la atención a una institución que está siendo públicamente cuestionada y que es la Fiscalía General del país. La Fiscalía se ha cuestionado en este momento histórico por su instrumentalización para criminalizar a los actores en esa lucha contra la corrupción. Y ahí vemos una gran cantidad de operadores de justicia que están o detenidos o en el exilio. Y encontramos también una gran cantidad de periodistas que están de igual manera o detenidos o en el exilio. Y el ataque evidente en contra del movimiento Semilla y del presidente y vicepresidenta electos en este. Entonces, creo que más allá de los nombres que individualicen a estos actores corruptos que vienen de escalas de poder alta hacia escalas menores, que son escalas de operatividad de esas estructuras criminales, nosotros podemos ver el impacto de sus acciones justamente en la democracia de Guatemala.
And in cases that are both political and so very personal, as I know some of you in the room experienced directly. Victoria, I wonder if you could speak to how the cooptation of justice worked in Claudina Isabel's case. In this case that was emblematic of violence against women and a lack of access to justice. You explained so in such concrete, almost satisfying terms exactly the way this worked in this case, that is an emblem of how it works for a lot of cases related to violence.
Sure, that's a really great question. Well, from the very beginning, the first issue is that Claudina Isabel's parents receive a phone call and very late at night that Claudina Isabel has called the mother of her boyfriend and says she's in danger, and then she screams and the phone goes dead. So the first obstacle that's faced is when they go to the police to seek assistance from the police, and the response of the police is, oh, surely she went off with a boyfriend. This happens all the time. We won't take a report for 24 hours. At 11 o'clock the next morning, because her parents and their family members had gone to every hospital, been looking in the streets, gone to the morgue, they identified Claudina Isabel Velásquez Paiz at 11 o'clock in the morning. The next place where she is completely ignored by the judicial system is that the medical examiner doesn't put a name on her case, even though she's identified. And at that time in 2005, if you look at the official government report on the numbers of women who were killed, they'll say most women are never identified. We think they're prostitutes and gang members, right? But Claudina Isabel is a 19-year-old law student who's identified at 11 o'clock in the morning. Every single time her case is discussed officially, from the police to the morgue to the prosecutors, they refer to her as Ekis, as a no name, until her father goes to court, pays a lawyer to make a complaint that the name has to be attached. And it takes until November. She's killed in August. It takes until November that her name is officially attached to the case in the morgue. And still in the morgue, the medical examiner refers to her as Ekis. Meanwhile, you have the crime scene, because there are a lot of different phases, right, in this investigation. You have the crime scene. What happens first? The bomberos, the firefighters come, and they find her, someone covers her with a sheet, we don't know. They find her in the street, someone covers her with a sheet, they call the police. The police come and they tromp all over the site, and then they call the investigators for the Ministerio Público, the prosecutor's office. They come out to collect evidence. We have photos of the evidence collection. They removed her sweater, and they used her sweater to wipe the blood from their hands. And I mean, the collection of evidence is absolutely appalling. And Jorge and I learned all of these steps by investigating how is it supposed to be done? What are you supposed to do at the crime scene? You're not supposed to have 3 different groups of people tromp through this crime scene, and you're certainly not supposed to take the sweater off the crime victim and then drop her back down onto the street and use her sweater to wipe your own hands. It's ridiculous. Further on, they make mistakes in the ballistics report. They make a report on ballistics that says the bullets that were found in February of 2005, that's months before she was killed. So they've mixed up the ballistics report. When we raise that to the prosecutor that there's a problem with the ballistics analysis, he says, oh no, that's not going to matter. And what he did is what I witnessed accompanying Jorge over and over again was absolutely dismissing the victim and the family by saying to Jorge, no, if we lose this case, it's not because of errors in the ballistic evidence. It's because you've taken this case to the press. It's because you've taken this case to the BBC because you're in a documentary about women being killed. That's why this case won't prosper. And then in a meeting with the head of the police who's investigating the case, he says to Jorge, you know, these cases, and this explains why there's a 98% impunity rate. This is the supervisor from the police, and he says, you know, these cases, they're just not resolvable. What you really have to do is just accept the fact that it won't be resolved. I mean, mataron mi tía. For me, they killed my aunt, but you know, these cases, they just don't get resolved. So the message is, if you were a reasonable citizen, you would accept the fact that there's no investigation or conviction or sanction for this murder. Meanwhile, when Jorge would say that that's not acceptable, the response would be, well, we don't believe your daughter was a virgin. We think she drank alcohol and she may have experimented with drugs, because that's what they also do, is try to shame families. And it's one of the reasons a lot of people wouldn't go forward with cases, because they don't want dishonor brought to their family. And it's victim precipitation. It's blaming the victim because of what she was wearing or where she was or who she was, that it's her fault she was killed, when it's really the fault of the murderer. And in Claudina Isabel's case, one of the things that I so admire about Jorge is that every time they would say that to this devoutly religious evangelical man, he would listen to them and he would look at them and he would say, my daughter may not have been an angel, I don't know, but what I do know is no young person should pay with their life for trying to experiment life, right? He would come back to her defense and move forward with the case. And this happened over and over again for years, and it never has been resolved, absolutely ever.
I want to turn directly, just take head on the issue of gender, women, the targeting of women. And I'm actually going to read from the book this beautiful and very chilling quote from Ana Maria. She says, I did not really understand what it meant to be a woman in Guatemala until Claudina Isabel was murdered. Ana Maria was a friend of Claudina Isabel, with her when she was murdered, or on the day she was murdered. She says, I understood what it meant when I read that my friend's murder, who did not yet have the legal term feminicide, wasn't worthy of investigation. I understood when I read the medical examiner's report that stated that my friend could not be sexually assaulted because she had previously had sexual relations. I understood what it meant to be a woman in Guatemala when no government authority had any interest in finding out who had kidnapped, beaten, and raped her. I understood when her case remained in impunity, like so many other Claudinas. Especially recently, attacks on lawyers, judges, and journalists have been taken up in the international community. There's been outcry and incredible work on the part of lawyers and civil society in Guatemala to draw attention to the issue. And most recently with the arrest of our colleague, Claudia Gonzalez. But it's actually rare that gender and the targeting of women comes into the conversation, and I want to put it squarely in this conversation. First, Victoria, can you explain the term feminicide? And then Erika, I want to turn to you to speak about the gender dynamics of the current situation. And you know, with these insidious omissions that you've just described at a very granular, specific level, what does it mean for the broader dynamics of feminicide at a societal level, institutional level?
Right. So there are a couple of things I want to add. So first, I want to just say one of the most striking interviews I had was with an investigator from the Ministerio Público who, through some friend of a friend of a friend, said, I hear Victoria Sanford's doing this research. I'd like to talk to her. And I was kind of like, well, who is this guy? Should I talk to him? And I did. I met him in a public place for coffee. And I interviewed him. And he wanted to talk about corruption in the Ministerio Público, which I thought was really interesting. But one of the striking parts of the conversation was, I said, well, are men and women treated differently? Do they treat women's cases differently, right? He thought about it and he said, no, I don't think so. I think that we treat them all the same. But then he proceeded to tell me two things. One was he remembered, because I asked that question about gender, he remembered being in the morgue with the director of the morgue at that time when it was still the Organismo Judicial, the director of the morgue, and he said to the director as they were discussing the killing of a teenage girl, isn't it terrible? All these young women being killed every day in Guatemala, and the response of the director of the morgue, the chief medical examiner charged with making sure that evidence is collected, his response was, what do they expect, taking on the roles of men? And so I think this undergirds a lot of the conversation, right? And so in terms of feminicide, what does that mean? Femicide was a term that was first initiated by feminist scholars talking about the murder of women, because the murder of women has different characteristics than the murder of men. And you can ask questions about that after, so I don't go off on a long track. But it later was picked up by the Canadian Royal Mounted Police and also the FBI, recognizing that in order to investigate murders, you need to understand what the MO looks like, what are typical situations that these murders take place in. So they started separating femicide from homicide purely for investigative reasons, not in there being any political reasons. Feminicide takes on a different position. Feminist scholars will say femicide is the killing of women because they are women. But when we talk about feminicide, we talk about state responsibility, because the killing of women isn't just the responsibility of the murderer. So if we think about it, the state is responsible clearly if the state is committing the murder, right? The commission of the murder, the state is responsible. But the state is also responsible when the police and the prosecutors look the other way and tolerate the murder. And the state is also responsible for the omission of its responsibility to investigate and sanction crimes. And in that sense, this government of Guatemala, the state, is responsible for the 98% of murder cases of women that it never investigates and sanctions. And that's feminicide, because the state is responsible. It's failing in its obligation to protect the right to life of all women and girls in that country.
And Erika, if you could just comment on how you view the gendered nature of the attacks on judges like yourself, prosecutors, journalists, and why it matters that women are being targeted in this situation, how people in the policy world and the international community should understand it, and just getting your perspective on the importance of the fact that this is a gendered dynamic.
Gracias por la pregunta. Es una pregunta muy importante. La verdad es que Guatemala tiene una historia en la que existe un conflicto armado interno, y desde ese momento muchas de las guerras y de las batallas que en el país se han librado es en contra de las mujeres, contra los cuerpos, contra la libertad, contra la vida de las mujeres. Y esperábamos que a partir de el acompañamiento que la Comisión Internacional contra la Impunidad dio, y también aquí quiero mencionar el trabajo relevante de algunas personas, dentro de ellas de la licenciada Telma Aldana, que comenzó cuando estaba en la Corte Suprema de Justicia a crear la jurisdicción de justicia especializada, juzgados y tribunales para mujeres, contra el femicidio y otras formas de violencia, y que luego desde la fiscalía fue una de las personas que trabajó conjuntamente con la CICIG, que entonces calificaba los casos para pedir y presentarlos ante la jurisdicción especializada de mayor riesgo, y en el que a través de la implementación de métodos especiales de escuchas telefónicas pudo salvar muchas vidas el equipo del Ministerio Público de mujeres. Es importante porque la población femenina en Guatemala cumple un rol indispensable para el desarrollo del país y siempre, como menciono, ha sido objeto de esos ataques. Y nosotros vemos que Guatemala no ha superado esa historia en este momento. ¿Y cómo se traslada ese ataque que se dio en la guerra interna? Ahora en la criminalización a las mujeres especialmente que están en esa lucha contra la corrupción y la impunidad. Y ahí no puedo dejar esta tarde de mencionar a Virginia La Parra, Claudia González, a Paola, a Alice, de la Fiscalía Especial contra la Impunidad y de la CICIG, quienes están siendo criminalizadas por hacer su trabajo, por luchar precisamente contra la corrupción, contra la impunidad. Y entonces ahí también esa reacción de los actores corruptos nos demuestran el impacto que estaba teniendo el trabajo de ellas y por qué era necesario detenerlo, obstaculizarlo. Y ahí también voy a explicar un poquito la conexión con el caso de Claudina, porque como bien explicaban hace un momento, en este caso específico la obtención de la justicia fue una lucha constante y no está conseguido en el país. Se consiguió una resolución internacional y esa resolución internacional que obliga a una investigación eficiente por parte del Estado de Guatemala hizo que el expediente de ellas fuera asignado al juzgado de mayor riesgo que estuvo a mi cargo. Sin embargo, no conocí nada respecto de ese proceso porque fue recibido días previos a mi salida y exilio del país. Entonces, vemos que esa cooptación del Estado sigue impactando en la vida de las mujeres, en la justicia dirigida a las mujeres.
It's been so clear in all of your comments so far how the law is used as a weapon. This is lawfare, it's criminalization. It also is consolidating power to control bodies and to control land, right? Virginia La Parra will have been in prison 2 years in February. Claudia now weeks in prison. And all of it based on the pretext of real cases. But we know the result is the control of their physical space and well-being and agency. And we also know that the attacks on justice sector personnel and journalists has a direct link to the takeover of land, indigenous land, resource-rich land. I wanted to ask each of you for your comments about those links. Erika, first, how does what's going on and what you've talked about so far, criminalization against a very targeted group, link to the greed that's involved and the consolidation of power over land and human bodies in particular?
Gracias. Hablábamos poco antes de iniciar esta conversación de que todos estos hechos quizás son más visibles en la ciudad capital y se invisibiliza en el área urbana, donde tenemos mujeres con mayores índices de vulnerabilidad. ¿Por qué? Tenemos mujeres indígenas, mujeres pobres, que tienen una doble o una triple discriminación por esas condiciones. Y en Guatemala también, lamentablemente, tenemos un bajo índice de mujeres que son propietarias de la tierra. Pero al interior de las comunidades hay territorios ancestrales o comunales que son parte de la vida cotidiana de mujeres, de niños, de ancianos, y estamos enfrentando también circunstancias que por la violencia, por la corrupción, por la impunidad, generan un aumento en el movimiento migratorio. Entonces encontramos que en estos territorios viven en su mayoría mujeres y niños, estas tierras. Pero también hemos visto, y hay un estudio fue realizado acá en Estados Unidos, de las áreas donde se ha implementado los desalojos forzados de estas comunidades y que tienen una vinculación directa, según este estudio, con organizaciones de crimen organizado, especialmente narcotráfico. También con algunos actos que están relacionados a actividades que dañan el medio ambiente. Y aquí mencionamos el cultivo de la palma africana, la situación de las mineras, etc. Y vemos ahí entonces que destaca mucho el activismo de mujeres por la defensa de esos territorios. Y encontramos como una respuesta del Estado a estas situaciones una gran represión. Creo que en la mente de muchos guatemaltecos quedarán las imágenes de todos los camiones y tanquetas militares y oficiales del ejército y policía caminando, enfilando por una situación de una minera en el territorio nacional en contra de una población y que resultó en la muerte de un periodista que el Estado negó y que es la muerte de una persona que participó en estas protestas y que como consecuencia de esto fue criminalizado un periodista porque el Estado negó esa muerte, pero el periodista había capturado en una fotografía el cuerpo tirado en el pavimento de esta persona. Y la respuesta del Estado fue iniciar procesos penales en contra del periodista. Entonces, vemos una vinculación muy grande en el tema de mujeres, migración y exclusión de la propiedad de la tierra.
Victoria, you write in detail about how cases like Claudina Isabel's and how it's handled by authorities has a chilling effect more broadly on the agency of women, and other stories where individuals are directly impacted by the same kind of lack of access to justice. But I'd love to hear you drawn out a bit about that impact on physical agency, so powerful as it relates to what democracy means, what it means to be a free human being.
Right, I think that's a really important question because if we think about like the core issues, and in fact, these were core issues in the Inter-American ruling on Claudina Isabel's case, that there was a violation of her right to life. There was a violation of her freedom of movement because there were decisions that were made by the police because of the zone of Guatemala City where she was found. The other point that was really interesting to me, and that was a debate within the court and there wasn't consensus on it, was freedom of expression, and the freedom of expression resting upon the way women can express themselves in their clothing. And this has been an issue for Indigenous women in Guatemala forever. But this was based on like what is quote unquote appropriate clothing to wear. So that's its own separate issue. But I think if we think about what it means for women's space to be collapsed down. So if you are a young woman and you are married, or in one of the stories in my book, a young woman who was actually sold into marriage when she was 12. And when she tries to escape, the police are going to give her back to her mother, who's going to give her back to the man who bought her, because he bought her, and she's his wife. But it's conjugal slavery. And a lot of women live in a condition of conjugal slavery. And if they try to escape because of the structure of their community, they're unable to do that. If they go to the police, they're monolingual Maya language speakers. They're not going to be listened to. If they are listened to, they will be returned to their family. They have no exit. If you have been attacked or assaulted, you go to a public health facility. The doctor who receives you doesn't do a rape kit, doesn't alert the police that a crime has taken place. Or in the case of one of the women in my book, when she went to the public health center, the doctor did a rape kit, said she'd never been raped, but when he was under oath in court, he admitted he had never previously done a gynecological exam. And so there's no collection of evidence. They go to the police don't help, the prosecutors don't help, they don't get to the court. Even if they had a good judge, they're not making it that far. And so what happens in the daily life of a woman? A young man I know, I was asking him about how things were going in his family. He knew I had written the book, El Genocidio, El Feminicidio. He had read that book, and he said, oh, the women in my family are fine, because not even to the corner store, ni a la tienda sin permiso, right? He's talking about his 23-year-old sister, and she can't go to the store without permission. So you have a complete collapse of social space, because the places that women are at greatest risk outside of their homes is at places where they're leaving one space for another, in an urban community, on a bus, going to the university, going to school, going to work. All the places that women need to be able to move freely to access. But if you can't do that because the state won't support your right of movement, then your freedom as an individual or a citizen in society collapses. And I also think that the points that Erika Aifan was just making about the criminalization, I mean, I look at this criminalization and arbitrary detention and the prolonged detention of justice operators and journalists. What I think that we're witnessing in Guatemala today is another form of disappearance, right? It used to be that forced disappearance in Guatemala, you got grabbed in the night and you weren't seen, but now it's a public display, right? It's a forced public disappearance. So everyone who thinks about raising their voice in opposition can know what potentially might happen to them. And right before this gathering today, I saw that there were students from the USAC who were demonstrating, and there was a video of a man from the SAS taking photos of all of those students. So minimally, that photography of security forces taking photos of students is a chilling effect on those students. But what are they doing with those photos? What are those photos being used for? And I think when we talk about hearkening back to the violence of the past and thinking about what the potentiality for that is, these are really serious questions. And the international community, the US government in particular, has a real responsibility to do more than just talk and say that it's bad. There are actors in that country who need to take a position supporting electoral democracy. And in the private sector, if they're unable to do that, then they should be sanctioned.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll talk a bit more about interventions in a little bit. I first want to just note, for those of you who are on Zoom, please feel free to add questions to the chat. We will do a Q&A, so there's a little bit more discussion. So go ahead and put your questions in the chat and we'll grab those. I want to talk about the concept of ambiguity as a tool in all of this. The ambiguity of disappearance, which has been called the perfect political crime in Guatemala, is more apparent. I think the themes of ambiguity related to forced exile, especially a mass targeted forced exile, the ambiguity that runs throughout the case of Claudina Isabel, because whereas there was a body found, there was so much lack of information all along the way. And I wanted each of you to speak, and Erika especially, about how ambiguity is playing a role as a tool of repression in the situation today, as it relates to forced exile and the arbitrary detentions that are taking place against so many, including people who are just under the everyday stress of the threat of arrest or the threat of having to make the decision that you had to make.
Gracias. La verdad es que puede incluso resultar fácil hablar y escuchar acerca del exilio, pero vivirlo es un tema muy distinto. Algunas personas creen que quienes están en el exilio están en un viaje bonito, en unas vacaciones, como alguien me mencionó en una oportunidad, le tocó una fuga bonita. Pero es muy interesante ponernos a pensar, ¿por qué no una, no muchas personas de un lapso de tiempo deciden abandonar su país? Y no es solo decidir abandonar su país, sino dejar sus carreras exitosas, dejar sus afectos, dejar sus creencias y tradiciones, dejar sus recuerdos en su país, para ir a un país que es desconocido y que, si bien debo decir, creo que de las historias que he tenido la oportunidad de conocer, las personas exiliadas han tenido una buena acogida, un buen acompañamiento por parte de los estados receptores, y en algunos casos han encontrado en sus países cosas, valores que parecen tan pequeños, tan íntimos, pero que revisten un gran valor para cada una de estas personas que viven en el exilio. Y me refiero, por ejemplo, a la libertad y a la seguridad. Es muy interesante si nosotros nos ponemos a pensar en qué puede impulsar a una persona a dejar todo lo que les compartía y respondernos que es el miedo. Realmente el miedo a que nos maten, el miedo a que nos detengan y nos torturen en una cárcel. ¿Y cuál es la ambigüedad que nosotros podemos más palpablemente ver en esto? La forma en que pueden torturar a una persona en la cárcel, dándole una apariencia de legalidad. Entonces pueden decir, esta persona, esta mujer, está detenida en la cárcel porque cometió un grave delito. Y cuando vamos a ver cuál es el grave delito, es haber presentado una denuncia contra una persona que ella consideró corrupta, por un acto corrupto. Y vamos a ver las detenciones, las condiciones de detención. Y entonces encontramos que está en un cuarto oscuro, sin luz, que sale a tomar la luz del sol 1 hora al día, que se le limita el acceso a las visitas de su familia y de sus abogados. Se le limita el acceso a las condiciones de salud, a una asistencia médica adecuada. Claro, eso no es tan visible al mundo exterior y puede parecernos no tan grave si comparamos con una tortura de otra naturaleza, como cuando le arrancaban las uñas a las personas. Puede causar un daño mayor. Es una forma de tortura más sutil. Y son formas, todas las que les he mencionado, son formas de tortura que están incluidas en el protocolo de Sanford. Pero entonces mostramos una realidad distinta a la comunidad internacional y al propio país, diciendo, esta persona, esta mujer, está detenida porque cometió un delito. Pero está el Estado utilizando una forma de represión menos entendible o más fácil de disfrazar ante un proceso aparentemente legal. Y pues para mí lo más triste es la respuesta que podemos encontrar ante los órganos de justicia. En mi país creo que ha sido evidente en los últimos días y me gustó mucho que una delegación internacional lo dijera. La Corte de Constitucionalidad, en lo personal, considero que es la máxima corte de mi país, Guatemala. Pero un organismo internacional dijo, cuando la Corte de Constitucionalidad tuvo que emitir un comunicado para explicar su resolución, esto dice que su resolución no cumplió con principios mínimos de claridad a los sujetos a quienes iba dirigido. Y entonces nos presentan claramente esa ambigüedad. Y esa ambigüedad es utilizada precisamente para mantener ese sistema corrupto de opresión, de represalia, de venganza, de impunidad y de corrupción. Por eso es importante decirlo, plasmarlo en las historias que se han conocido y buscar los espacios. Y es importante también que las personas que están en el exilio puedan comprender que a pesar de lo difícil de su situación, siguen siendo actores importantes para el cambio en sus respectivos países, que su voz es poderosa.
I want to make sure there's time for questions. So I wonder if we could situate some of these issues in the current transitional period. From your perspective, Erika, how does the targeting of women and the cooptation of justice relate to basic democratic guarantees in this transition period? For the hope that the new administration will take power, and even in the event that it doesn't, we know that there's a calculated strategy to ensure that that doesn't happen. Talk to us a little bit about how these particular themes play on what is to come in this transition.
Gracias por la pregunta, es muy importante. Les mencioné los tres grupos diferenciados que han sido atacados en ese orden por el pacto de corruptos: operadores de justicia, periodistas y personas que han participado en política. Actualmente el presidente electo y la vicepresidenta electa en mi país. Y tiene un sentido que se los haya compartido en ese orden, porque son tres pilares fundamentales de la democracia. Los operadores de justicia son los defensores de derechos humanos de primera línea. Los fiscales, los jueces y todo el personal que labora dentro del sistema de administración de justicia son los primeros llamados a defender los derechos de todas las personas y especialmente de aquellas poblaciones especialmente vulnerables, donde incluimos a las mujeres y niñas. Los periodistas independientes son los encargados de informar, partir esa información tan importante en dos vías: denunciar la corrupción, denunciar los hechos criminales, pero también informar a la población de todo el desarrollo, el funcionamiento del Estado, de las instituciones, hacer las críticas correspondientes y, pues, fundamentalmente, el sistema de elecciones libres. Pero en mi país han sido atacados en ese orden, porque pues esperaban optar plenamente el Estado a través de la elección de alguna persona que pudiera tener vínculos o compromisos con esa criminalidad organizada. El fenómeno del movimiento Semilla, que ganó para pasar a la segunda vuelta, y en la segunda vuelta, de manera clara y contundente, como lo ha dicho el Parlamento Europeo, ganó las elecciones sin ninguna duda en un proceso electoral transparente que estuvo a los ojos del mundo y en el cual el propio Ministerio Público se jactó, se ufanó desde la primera vuelta de haber desplegado un plan de protección institucional para garantizar esa transparencia de las elecciones y desplegó personal uniformado con los chalecos distintivos del Ministerio Público para observar el desarrollo de las elecciones. Ahora no acepta los resultados e inicia acciones legales en contra de quienes resultaron electos como presidente y vicepresidenta, en contra del movimiento Semilla. Y pues lamentablemente, como abogada, conozco los procedimientos, conozco la ley y sé que la resolución que fue emitida de suspensión del partido es una resolución inconstitucional. Y cuando estudié en la universidad hace muchos años, mis profesores dijeron, una resolución inconstitucional es una resolución nula ipso juris, de pleno derecho. No hay un mecanismo legal que pueda darle validez. Sin embargo, esos presupuestos parecen haber cambiado en el país. Y en este momento en el que han debilitado esos tres pilares fundamentales de la justicia, pues Guatemala está en una línea muy frágil de romper la poquita democracia que le queda. Pero frente a esto, pues debo decir que con mucho orgullo y satisfacción veo la reacción de la población guatemalteca, que está exigiendo el respeto a su voluntad soberana, porque nuestra Constitución dice que es el pueblo el que es el soberano en el país, no las autoridades. Y está pidiendo en las calles y en las cortes el respeto al voto, el respeto a su decisión, que ha sido clara y contundente. Y bueno, me queda esperar en este contexto que vive actualmente en mi país, que las altas cortes puedan responder a las expectativas del pueblo y puedan garantizar esa decisión libre de los guatemaltecos y guatemaltecas. Lo contrario resultaría en la pérdida total de la democracia.
Victoria, I want to take the opportunity to have you speak a little bit about what the international community can do. We are sitting in Washington, considering that location, the responsibility of the United States government across many decades in Guatemala, related to violation of human rights, the cooptation of justice, and also the significant backing of the work of CC, championing of anti-corruption efforts there. What are some of the potent interventions that the US and other actors in the international community can take to support exactly what Erika just described?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a really great question, and I think that Erika's response was so eloquent and comprehensive about Guatemala. I do want to add that if anyone has wondered who are all those Guatemalans going out into the street for a little tiny political party that became a movement because it's an anti-corruption party, I'll tell you who they are. They're the 70% of Guatemalans who approved of the Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala. Because before CICIG was dismantled by then President Jimmy Morales, he had less than a 20% approval rating, but CICIG had more than a 70% rating. And those are the people who are out in the streets because they don't want to live in a corrupt country. So I would start there. And in terms of what the US can do, I think the first step needs to be to recognize that we need actual real policies that work in real time in Guatemala, instead of just giving lip service and making statements about what we believe in We need to put money behind it, but not just money behind it. We support NGOs that work with women who are victims of gender violence. Let's sanction companies in that country who are supporting corruption. Sanction companies that have child labor. That's a human rights violation. Those companies can be sanctioned. Show me a coffee plantation where children aren't working in Guatemala. I'd like to see one. Show me a sugar plantation where there aren't children cutting sugar cane involved in really dangerous activities. Those are real spaces as well. And I also, the other part also in looking for making sanctions, I think there can be sectoral sanctions in different parts of the economy. And the response is, well, you can't do sanctions that way because it will hurt regular people. It will hurt workers in Guatemala. But if you choose specific sectors, you don't make it for all sectors in Guatemala, but you say, we will recognize the role of the families that are the main beneficiaries of sugar companies, of coffee, African palm oil, very specific industries, but not affect all of them. So you don't go after agricultural exporters. So you're not hitting the small farmers, the family farmers that actually are still involved in some of the export practices. It's not going to harm everyone as much as the current debacle and slow coup in Guatemala is. And if you look at the amount of trade that the United States has had with Guatemala over the last 10 years, 2022 is the largest amount of trade that Guatemala has had with the United States. And so if the US would just choose one or two of these very corrupt industries and say, you know, you need to clean up your act, and also we need you to take a stand for democracy, I think it would make a real difference. And lastly, I mean, the presence of people who I so honored by the work that you've done in your country here today, it also just makes me so sad that people are here today instead of in their country, making that a stronger democracy, strengthening the rule of law. But I also firmly believe that your presence here, as well as the presence of other exiled justice operators in Mexico and other parts of Latin America and Europe, that you contribute to building rule of law by continuing to stand up for justice. And I know for me, it's truly an honor to be with all of you. So thank you.
Just to close before we go to questions, I want to read a message posted by the organization Coincidir the day that you were forced into exile, Erika. Erika Aifan, one day we will return to gather under the tree you planted, together with the girls who look up to you, eat sweet peaches and smile, happy, celebrating the return of justice and that we were able to build a new country where everyone can live with dignity. I wanted to just ask what that meant to you, what it means to you, what you hope for the next generation.
Wow. La verdad es que para mí significó la esperanza en esas niñas que están vulnerables, están excluidas de nuestra sociedad. Y les comparto, estábamos sembrando juntas un durazno. Fue uno de los últimos días que estuve en el país. Lo compartí todo con ellas, todo el día. Y fue bonito y difícil esa despedida. Una de las niñas que había sido víctima de violación, muy pequeñita, no llega a los 10 años, me dijo, quiero preguntarte algo. ¿Por qué los jueces no me creen? Y esas palabras me han acompañado pensando que no son solo los jueces que no me creen, es el Estado que no le está creyendo. Es el Estado que no le ha creído a Claudina, que no le ha creído a ninguna mujer. Y también, a partir de ese momento, el compromiso personal de decir, pues, ya no soy parte del Estado, porque dejé de ser juez, fui obligada a exiliarme, pero tengo la obligación de responderles, no solo a esa niña, sino a todas las niñas en mi país, porque en ese momento, créanme que no tuve palabras para responder una pregunta tan profunda, tan difícil. Pero después de eso, cada día he pensado cómo responder a esas niñas, cómo cambiar las condiciones de las mujeres en nuestro país. Gracias a la institución que me recibió acá en Estados Unidos, gracias a todas las instituciones de derechos humanos que trabajan por la protección de estos a nivel mundial, sigo en ese tema y sigo con los mensajes bonitos de esperanza. Después de esto recibí un video donde el grupo de niñas estaban mostrándome cómo ha crecido el arbolito, cómo ha dado sus primeras flores y cómo todas ellas alrededor del arbolito se peleaban ese día por regarlo y por mandarme el mensaje. No fueron palabras en vano, lo estamos cuidando. Y la estamos esperando. Y ese la estamos esperando están esperando, no a Erika, Aifan, están esperando la justicia, la libertad, la vida que les permita a ellas crecer, soñar y vivir plenamente en Guatemala. Y creo que ese es uno de los mensajes más inspiradores en los días en que se hace más difícil esta carga y en que con respecto a esto y me entristezco, las recuerdo ese entusiasmo a pesar de sus historias trágicas, a pesar de lo difícil que les está haciendo luchar tan pequeñitas contra el sistema. Entonces quiero concluir con eso, concluir con que las niñas de Guatemala nos están dando un gran ejemplo de valor y de esperanza. Nosotros debemos de seguir luchando por ellas y por sostener la democracia en nuestro país desde el espacio en el que estamos.
Thank you. Thank you both. Love to invite questions. The audience.
I'll go. Hola, buenas tardes. Hi everyone. My name is Aina Garcia. I really appreciated this dialogue. Thank you to WOLA for putting this together. This conversation can be a little bit triggering for a lot of people. I come from a border city. I come from El Paso, Texas. And 10 women a day are killed in Mexico and Ciudad Juarez. And Ciudad Juarez was the most dangerous city in the world at one point. You know, it's just triggering. I guess, how can we help these women? Like, how can we offer them the resources? Because I've done some research and there has been some, you know, like WhatsApp messages in certain Latin American countries where they come together on a WhatsApp. There's another, there was a curfew implemented where the women could be out until a certain time and the men could be out during a certain time. We don't have immigration policies that embody humanity. We really don't. As someone who would love that, we don't. How can we fight towards helping these women? I mean, how can we fight towards a more humane immigration policy where we don't shut our doors to asylum seekers that are victims of gender-based violence? How do we do that?
try to answer that question. Well, that's one of the many $10,000 questions, right? Because there's no straight, easy answer for that. And I agree. I mean, I understand when you said that this is a triggering conversation, listening to these stories. I also think anyone who saw the title of today's talk and read what the description was would know that we would be discussing issues that are really difficult, not just for them, but also for us to speak about it, because we're speaking about people we know and love when we talk about it as well. But I think in terms of immigration policy, clearly we need immigration reform in this country. I mean, that's like the simple answer. We need immigration reform, and we need to elect people into the government and demand immigration reform. Our immigration policy are ridiculous, and they're not only ridiculous from a humanitarian standpoint, because you're absolutely right. We shouldn't rip babies away from women when they're at the border because they're fleeing violence. That's absurd. It's cruel and it's wrong. But it's also an impractical policy. The infrastructure bills that have been passed by this administration that call for huge infrastructure development in the United States, do you know what's stopping many of those projects from moving forward? Lack of labor. We don't have a lack of labor. We have a lack of labor that's recognized as legal. We have a whole class of second-class citizens, second-class human beings in this country who are workers, who live here, who can't take on jobs that we need them to take on because we won't recognize that they live here. It's ridiculous. So we need immigration reform. There's another question. Yes.
Anything to add about the question of immigration, humane policy?
Solo quiero agregar algo pequeño y creo que es importante seguir sensibilizando a las personas. Mencionaba que hay dos valores importantes que por lo menos en lo personal puedo decir que he vivido acá en Estados Unidos, la libertad y la seguridad. Y entonces tal vez puede ser también difícil para una persona en este país entender las circunstancias especiales que viven nuestras mujeres, nuestras niñas en México, en Guatemala, en El Salvador, en otros países donde la violencia y la discriminación son más marcadas. Entonces también es importante sensibilizarlos para que ellos puedan comprender de una mejor manera por qué también muchas mujeres, muchas niñas emigran a este país porque en sus países son objeto de violencia. Una persona deja todo por nada, por algo incierto. Las condiciones de los migrantes en un país extraño son muy difíciles. Entonces, ponernos a pensar un poquito en eso y sensibilizar a las personas. Gracias.
Hola, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Patricia, soy abogada salvadoreña en el exilio también. Y bueno, yo creo que la historia de Claudina se repite en El Salvador y en toda la región. Y más que una pregunta, quizás es un comentario y traer a cuenta cómo siempre los procesos, ya sean naturales o sociales, cómo tienen una vinculación directa con la mujer. El tema de la pandemia, ¿verdad? Que se suponía que la casa o el hogar era la que iba a proteger a las mujeres, resultó ser esa, su cárcel o su cementerio.
Sí.
Entonces, estos procesos naturales como también afectan. En estos procesos de cooptación del Estado, de la democracia, estamos invisibilizando un sector que siempre ha sido invisibilizado, que es el de las mujeres. ¿Por qué? Porque los temas en la agenda llegan a ser otros y el de la mujer queda relegado. Algunas veces también los que nos están ayudando, que nos quisieran facilitar estos procesos de cambio en pro de la mujer, que estancan esos procesos porque creemos que no podemos hablar de derechos de la mujer cuando ni siquiera podemos abrir el paraguas para hablar de lo más básico que es la democracia. Entonces venimos y somos doblemente victimizadas. Entonces, en estos procesos tan difíciles, la atención especializada de los migrantes, de las instituciones, deben de ser mucho más fuertes a la protección de estos derechos.
Muchas gracias por compartir tu comentario.
So yo creo que I should say, I think it's a really important point. I can't speak in Spanish, so it seems like we're here to speak Spanish. Yo creo que este es un punto sumamente importante, porque la pandemia hizo un énfasis, si vemos las estadísticas de violencia contra la mujer, del asesinato de la mujer, y es una muestra muy fuerte de que el lugar en donde la mujer está con más riesgo es en su propia casa. Es un punto muy importante y le agradezco bastante para recordarnos de esto, ¿no? Y además, entonces tenemos que encontrar la manera de proteger a las mujeres en el espacio privado, porque esto es responsabilidad del Estado, porque siempre se han separado estos dos ámbitos, ¿verdad? El espacio privado, espacio público. Pero el espacio privado también está regulado por el Estado. Entonces, yo creo que otra vez hay que exigir, tanto en la política extranjera de Estados Unidos y la política de la Comunidad Europea, de empatizar, no solo apoyar las organizaciones, pero también de usar como la caja de herramientas que tenemos para poner presión a estos países. Y yo siento que hay demasiado timidez en utilizar las sanciones económicas. Y los utilizamos a los que están categorizados como enemigos fácilmente, pero a los que queremos como aliados estamos un poco más tímidos de hacerlo. Pero yo pienso que el intercambio entre los países de Centroamérica y Estados Unidos y también con México y países en el Cono Sur, que debemos que hacer acuerdos que son interamericanos sobre estas sanciones también.
One or two more questions, and if there's anything on Zoom.
Yo solo quisiera hacer un comentario también. Bueno, en primer lugar, agradecer muchísimo a Victoria por todo el trabajo que ha hecho histórico en Guatemala. Muchas gracias, porque la lucha de Claudina no fue una lucha solo de Jorge Velásquez, su papá, o nosotras las amigas de ella, sino lo poco que se logró, especialmente de visibilizar el caso, fue gracias a este apoyo incondicional que hubo. Agradecer a Erika también por todo su trabajo en la justicia en Guatemala. Como mujer jueza, además, que se enfrentan grandes desafíos. Muchas gracias. Sé que es muy difícil el exilio. Yo lo viví de niña, tal vez no plenamente consciente de lo que significaba, pero sé, lo he vivido, y siempre en mi solidaridad contigo, Erika, y a Poli y a Ava también por ayudarnos en la organización de este evento tan importante. También una mención especial a la calidad de la audiencia que tenemos el día de hoy. Especialmente porque tenemos a personas que han luchado mucho por la justicia en sus países. En El Salvador, el juez Guzmán, bienvenido, gracias, muchas gracias por toda la labor que usted ha hecho en la justicia salvadoreña. Por supuesto, a la exfiscal general Telma Aldana, que como ya se mencionó acá, también jugó un rol muy importante en promover la justicia para las mujeres. Gracias por estar acá, y nada más, para mí en lo personal es muy especial este evento porque, como ya se mencionó, Claudina era amiga mía, estudiábamos juntas Derecho, teníamos solo 19 años cuando este caso ocurrió, y creo que Claudina sentó un precedente histórico importante en Guatemala. La lucha que hicimos era para que su nombre no quede, que es reivindicar su nombre, y el hecho de que, si bien hay muchos retos que es aún por enfrentar, el hecho de que haya una ley contra el femicidio, el hecho de que las nuevas generaciones de mujeres jovencitas
amen ya de violencia contra la mujer, algo que nosotras no hacíamos en nuestro momento, es un logro ya importante. Entonces, gracias a todos y todos y pues bueno, aquí un aplauso y un homenaje para Claudina.
Gracias, Ana María.
Thank you, Ana Maria. What a beautiful note to end on. Invite you all to continue the conversation formally. Thank you. And thanks to everyone who joined online.
And to the translators and to Ali and everyone who's helping here, Ali and for all the people who made it happen.